If rebirth is real, why don't we remember our past lives? Buddha's wisdom revealed. Imagine this: you sit in silence, maybe with a warm cup of tea, or perhaps you're simply gazing at the horizon, lost in thought. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a question arises, a question that has puzzled humanity for millennia. If I have lived before, why don't I remember my past lives? It's a question that resonates deep within our souls, sparking curiosity and wonder about the very nature of our existence. How is it possible to live, die, and then live again, yet not recall any of it? Why do we seem to have no recollection of the experiences that should have shaped us through countless lifetimes? It's a profound inquiry, one that for centuries has intrigued and mystified philosophers, scholars, and spiritual seekers alike. But here's the thing: this question is not just a casual pondering, it's a doorway to understanding something far deeper, far more transformative. The Buddha himself grappled with this enigma, offering an answer that shatters conventional beliefs and invites us to question everything we thought we knew about the self. What if the very fact that we don't remember is not a flaw in the system, but a key to unlocking the wisdom of our true nature? In this video, we'll dive deep into the heart of this mystery, exploring the Buddha's profound teachings on the impermanence of memory, the illusion of the self, and the transformative power of the present moment. What if forgetting is not a curse, but a gift, a hidden mercy that frees us to live fully in the here and now? Trust me, this video is packed with insights that will challenge your perspective on life, memory, and the very essence of who you are. Keep watching until the end, because each moment is a step closer to understanding the path to liberation. This isn't just another philosophical debate, it's a journey that could change the way you approach every moment of your life. So if you've ever found yourself asking, "Why don't I remember?" or wondering about the mysteries of rebirth and karma, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment, because this is a conversation that goes beyond ordinary understanding. Let's explore the wisdom of forgetting together. Chapter 1: The Illusion of the Permanent Self, Embracing the Buddha's Insight. The Buddha's teachings on anatta, or non-self, strike at the very heart of human understanding. They invite us to question everything we believe about our identity, our past, and our very existence. The concept of anatta unveils a profound truth: there is no permanent self. In fact, the idea of a permanent self is an illusion, a misconception that perpetuates our suffering and binds us to the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. This insight, though simple in its essence, carries with it the power to transform the way we experience life itself. We often think of ourselves as a fixed entity, a being that carries memories from one life to the next, a soul that retains experiences, emotions, and attachments. In many spiritual traditions, such as Hinduism, this is precisely the belief, that the Atman, or soul, travels through lifetimes, holding onto the essence of who we are. But the Buddha offers a radically different view. According to him, there is no permanent, unchanging self. What we call I is not an eternal soul or a fixed identity that moves through time and space. Instead, the Buddha saw life as a continuous flow of consciousness, shaped by the laws of cause and effect, or karma. He compared it to a river. The waters of a river are constantly changing, flowing, and evolving, yet we still call it the same river. In the same way, we too are constantly changing, our thoughts, our feelings, our physical bodies, and even our memories. We are not a permanent self, but rather a stream of consciousness that moves through time, always transforming, always in flux. The Buddha's insight into why we don't remember our past lives is rooted in this understanding of the mind. Our minds, clouded by ignorance, avijja, and driven by craving, a letter 1e47ha macron, become entangled in the illusion of a permanent self. We cling to the idea that there is an I who exists independently, a fixed identity that can remember its past experiences. But in reality, just as one cannot see their reflection in disturbed water, we cannot clearly perceive our true nature because our minds are clouded by these illusions. Think of a clear pond perfectly still. The surface reflects the world around it unblemished. Now imagine throwing a stone into that pond. The water ripples, the reflection shatters, and the surface becomes clouded and disturbed. In the same way, our perception of self is clouded by the ripples of desire, attachment, and aversion. These mental disturbances obscure our ability to see the truth of who we really are. This illusion of a permanent self creates the misconception that we should remember our past lives. When we ask, "Why don't I remember?" we are already lost in a false assumption, the belief that there is a permanent I who could remember. But the Buddha teaches us that memory, like everything else, is not fixed. It is a living process, constantly shaped and reshaped each time we recall it. Memories are not static files stored in our minds, but rather ever-changing reflections of the moment. A powerful example of this can be seen in the experience of a dream. When we dream, we often feel as if the events we experience are real, as if we are someone else, somewhere else. Upon waking, the dream fades and we are left with only fragments, pieces of an experience that seemed so vivid and real in the moment. Memory is much like a dream, fleeting, transient, and ever-changing. Just as the dream vanishes upon waking, so too does our memory of past lives slip away with the passing of time. This is why the Buddha did not teach us to focus on remembering past lives. Instead, he invited us to understand the nature of the mind in the present. Memory, like everything else, is impermanent. The attachment to the idea of a permanent self, capable of recalling a fixed past, only perpetuates our suffering. As long as we remain attached to the illusion of a permanent I, we remain trapped in the cycle of birth and rebirth, bound by our cravings and desires. The Buddha's teaching on memory offers us an important lesson. Memory is not a static, unchanging thing, but a process that is constantly being reshaped. It is influenced by our present perceptions, desires, and emotional states. In the same way that the river's waters are constantly flowing, our memories are constantly being updated, modified, and transformed by the mind's ever-changing nature. Think about a time when you recalled a particular event from your past. At first, it may have seemed vivid and clear, but as you reflected on it more deeply, you might have noticed that the details began to shift. The emotions you felt in the moment might have faded, or new interpretations of the event might have emerged. This is the nature of memory. It is fluid, dynamic, and subject to the influence of the present. The Buddha teaches us that this fluidity of memory reflects the impermanent nature of all things. Our attachment to the idea that there is a fixed I who can remember is what leads us into confusion. Just as the river is never the same from one moment to the next, so too are we constantly changing. The past is not something we can cling to or hold on to. It is something that exists only in the present moment, shaped by our current thoughts and perceptions. If we are not a permanent self, then what continues from one life to the next? The Buddha answers this question by pointing to the law of karma, the law of cause and effect. Karma is not something external to us, but an inherent part of our consciousness. It is the energy of our actions, driven by intention, that continues from one life to the next, not in the form of memory or identity, but as a continuous momentum that shapes the conditions of our future lives. Consider the example of a candle flame. One flame can light another, but the second flame is not the same as the first. It is a continuation of the same energy. Similarly, our actions create karmic energy that shapes the course of our future, but this energy does not carry with it our memories or a fixed identity. It is the momentum of our past actions, our intentions, that continues forward, shaping our experiences without the need for a permanent self to carry them. The Buddha teaches us that rebirth is not about a soul traveling from one life to the next, but about the continuation of karmic momentum. This momentum is not something we can easily see or measure, but it influences the conditions of our lives, the opportunities we encounter, and the challenges we face. This is why the Buddha emphasized that our present actions are the most important factor in shaping our future. If we live with wisdom, compassion, and mindfulness, we create the conditions for a peaceful and liberated future, free from the cycle of suffering. The key to freedom, then, lies in letting go of the attachment to a permanent self. When we stop clinging to the idea of a fixed I, a self that exists independently of time and change, we begin to see the world as it truly is. We begin to see the flow of consciousness, unimpeded by the illusion of permanence. In that moment, we are free from the cycle of suffering and rebirth, for we no longer identify with the fleeting and transient nature of our thoughts, feelings, and memories. The Buddha's insight into the impermanent nature of the self offers us a path to liberation. It invites us to stop searching for permanence in a world that is constantly changing. Instead, we are invited to embrace the flow of life, to live fully in the present moment, and to cultivate wisdom and compassion in everything we do. When we stop clinging to the past or to a fixed identity, we open ourselves to the fullness of life as it is, a life that is ever-changing, ever-evolving, and full of potential. In the end, the Buddha's teachings remind us that true freedom comes not from remembering who we were or clinging to past identities, but from awakening to who we are right now, an ever-changing stream of consciousness, free from the illusions of the self and flowing toward the liberation of all beings. Chapter 2: Memory as a Fleeting Ripple, Understanding the Role of Forgetting. The Buddha's teachings offer a profound invitation, one that goes against much of what we are taught in our day-to-day lives. He invites us to let go of our attachment to memory as proof of the truth of our existence. Memory, much like the illusion of a permanent self, is an impermanent and shifting phenomenon, not something that we should cling to as a fixed reference point in our understanding of who we are or what is real. Imagine a moment in your life when you remember something so clearly that it feels like it happened yesterday. The faces, the sounds, even the emotions of that moment appear vivid and sharp. Yet over time, as the years pass, the details begin to fade. A name that once was familiar becomes blurred, a story you told yourself begins to shift, and slowly, the memory itself changes. We forget names, we rewrite events in our minds, and sometimes, though we may not realize it, our minds even invent memories that never truly happened. In this way, memory becomes like a fleeting ripple on the surface of a pond, shaping and reshaping with every passing moment, yet never holding its form for long. This realization is not new, it is something the Buddha spoke of thousands of years ago. He understood that memory is not a static, unchanging record of our past, but rather a living process, one that is influenced by the flow of the present. We recall memories not as precise recordings of an unchanging past, but as fluid impressions that shift over time, often in ways that reflect our current emotions, perceptions, and even desires. If memory is so unreliable within a single lifetime, so prone to distortion and forgetting, how could we expect it to remain intact across lifetimes? If we cannot hold on to the memories of our current life, how can we possibly claim to remember past lives? This is where the Buddha's wisdom shines through. Memory, he teaches, is not the ultimate proof of existence or continuity. It is simply one aspect of our perception, sanyanya, and like all perceptions, it is ever-changing and impermanent. To understand this more deeply, let's consider a simple example from everyday life. Think about a river. As you stand at the edge, you see the water flowing past. The water, once it passes, is gone. You can't grab the same water again, it's always moving, always changing. but we still call it the river because we recognize a pattern in its flow. In the same way, our memories flow through us. They appear and disappear, shaping our understanding of ourselves, but they are not fixed. They are like water in the river, constantly passing, constantly changing. Now imagine for a moment a person who has experienced a traumatic event. For years, they remember that moment with great detail, recalling the faces, the words, the emotions they felt. But with time, as they grow and evolve, their perception of that event changes. The emotions tied to the memory may soften, or new insights may emerge, and gradually, the memory takes on a different shape. The memory is not the same as it was on the day it was formed, even though the event itself may have happened long ago. This is the impermanent nature of memory, the Buddha's insight into how it shifts with time, the way it bends and reshapes according to the state of our minds in the present. The Buddha invites us to recognize that just as memories are fluid, so too is the self. The I that we so often cling to as permanent and unchanging is no different from our memories. Both are constructs of the mind, constantly in flux, shaped by the thoughts and perceptions we have in any given moment. When we ask, "Why don't I remember my past lives?" we are caught in the illusion of a fixed, permanent self, one that expects to have memories from past lives that are just as fixed and unchanging as we want our present identity to be. But this is not the nature of memory, nor the nature of self. Modern science, though only beginning to catch up with the Buddha's ancient insights, has confirmed much of what he taught. Memory is not a file we store away in our minds. It is a living process, one that we reconstruct every time we recall something. When you think about an event from your past, your mind does not simply pull out a neatly stored file from a mental archive. Instead, your brain replays the experience, adding new layers of meaning and reinterpretation based on your present state. Memory, in a sense, is like writing on the surface of a stream, constantly forming, blurring, and eventually vanishing as the current flows. This idea of memory as a living process carries profound implications for how we understand the mind and its relationship to the past. If memory is always changing, always fluid, then it cannot be the bedrock of our identity or the proof of our existence. It is just another aspect of our perception, one that arises in the moment and fades as quickly as it appeared. Our identities, too, are constantly changing, reshaped by the flow of life and the experiences we encounter. To hold on to memories as proof of who we are is to cling to something that is fleeting, something that will inevitably slip away. The Buddha's teachings on memory invite us to embrace the impermanence of all things, including the memories that shape our sense of self. Rather than seeing memory as a fixed record of who we were, we are encouraged to see it as a reflection of who we are in this moment. This insight helps to free us from the attachment to the past, allowing us to live fully in the present, unburdened by the weight of memories that no longer serve us. But what about forgetting? The Buddha also teaches that forgetting is not something to be feared or avoided. It is, in fact, a gift. When we forget, we free ourselves from the chains of the past, from the identities and stories we have constructed around ourselves. We are not bound by what we remember. Instead, we are free to experience each moment anew without the baggage of past experiences weighing us down. Consider the example of a person who has suffered a great loss, a death, a betrayal, or a deep disappointment. In time, the sharp pain of that loss begins to fade, replaced by a deeper understanding or acceptance. This process of forgetting does not erase the memory, but it allows the person to heal and move forward. Forgetting, then, is not erasure, but a kind of mercy, a way to release us from the emotional and psychological weight of past events so that we can live more freely in the present. In the same way, our attachment to past memories keeps us tethered to old identities and old wounds. When we forget, when we let go of the need to cling to our memories as if they are proof of who we are, we create space for healing and transformation. The Buddha's insight into the impermanence of memory helps us to see that we are not defined by what we remember, but by how we choose to live in each moment. So when we ask ourselves, "Why don't I remember my past lives?" we are missing the deeper truth that the Buddha sought to reveal. Memory is not the foundation of our existence. We are not our memories. We are not the sum of the experiences we recall, nor the identities we construct around those experiences. We are something much deeper, much more profound, a flowing, ever-changing stream of consciousness, shaped by our actions, our intentions, and our present awareness. The Buddha teaches us that the key to understanding our true nature is not to cling to the past or to seek proof of past lives, but to awaken to the present moment. In the present, we are free to transform, free to create new possibilities, free to let go of the memories and identities that no longer serve us. When we let go of our attachment to memory, we open ourselves to the fullness of life as it is, ever-changing, ever-flowing, and full of potential. In the end, the Buddha's teachings remind us that true freedom lies not in remembering or forgetting, but in understanding that memory is just one fleeting ripple in the vast ocean of our existence. When we stop clinging to the past, we are free to experience life as it truly is, impermanent, fluid, and full of infinite possibilities. Chapter 3: Karma, the energy that continues beyond memory. When we think about the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, we often find ourselves wondering what truly carries forward from one life to the next. If memories fade and our identities shift, what is it that continues on, transcending the boundaries of time and space? The Buddha's teachings offer us an answer that shifts our perspective entirely. It's not our memories or an eternal soul that carries us through lifetimes, but karma, the energy of our actions, shaped by our intentions. This is the force that transcends the illusion of memory and allows for the continuity of our journey through birth and rebirth. In the world we live in, memory is seen as a form of continuity. It's how we connect our past with our present. We rely on our memories to define who we are, to explain why we act the way we do, and to link our experiences to our sense of self. But the Buddha pointed out something revolutionary. Memory itself is fleeting, unreliable, and inherently impermanent. So if memory cannot serve as the foundation of rebirth, what else remains? What continues beyond the reach of time? The answer, according to the Buddha, is karma, the energy created by our actions, driven by the deepest currents of intention. Karma is not a system of rewards or punishments, as is commonly perceived. It is not about earning a heavenly reward or enduring suffering for our sins. Instead, karma is the natural law that governs the unfolding of our lives, driven by our intentions and actions. Every action, no matter how small, creates an imprint that shapes the future. These imprints are not conscious memories, nor are they part of a permanent self. They are subtle yet powerful, energies that influence the conditions of our lives in ways we may not even recognize. The Buddha used the metaphor of a seed to explain karma. Just as a seed is planted in the soil and over time sprouts into a plant, our actions, whether positive or negative, plant karmic seeds that grow and eventually bear fruit. If we act with compassion, kindness, and mindfulness, we plant seeds of peace, joy, and wisdom. Conversely, if we act out of greed, hatred, or delusion, we plant seeds of suffering, anxiety, and confusion. These seeds may not sprout immediately, but they will take root and over time shape the experiences we encounter in this life and in future ones. In this way, karma is not bound by time. A simple act of kindness today can create ripples that echo through future lifetimes, just as a harmful act can leave its mark, shaping the future in ways we may not understand at the time. This is why the Buddha emphasized the importance of mindful actions, because every choice we make, every intention we cultivate, plants a karmic seed that will eventually manifest in our lives. To further understand how karma operates beyond our conscious memory, we look to the concept of alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness. This is an essential teaching in Buddhism, which suggests that while our conscious memories may fade with death, the karmic imprints we create remain deeply embedded within the storehouse of our consciousness. These imprints are not part of our everyday awareness, but they shape our instincts, desires, and behaviors in profound ways. Imagine a child who has an intense fear of water, even though they have never been in a situation where they could have drowned. This fear could be the result of karmic imprints from a past life, where the child may have had a traumatic experience related to water. Similarly, someone who has an effortless talent for music or a deep connection to a particular skill, despite never having trained in that art, may be carrying karmic seeds from past actions and experiences. The karmic energy we create doesn't vanish when we forget it. It remains stored in our subconscious, influencing us in ways we may not understand. This concept helps to explain many of the mysterious traits we carry in our present lives. Why do we have certain fears or tendencies that we can't explain? Why do we feel an unexplainable affinity towards certain places, people, or activities? These, the Buddha suggests, are the results of karmic imprints from past actions, seeds planted long ago, whose fruits we may not yet fully comprehend. The energy of karma does not rely on memory. This is a crucial point. Even though we may not remember the specific actions we took in past lives, the effects of those actions continue to ripple through our present experience. Our present circumstances, the relationships we form, the challenges we face, and the successes we achieve are the results of the seeds we planted in past actions. These karmic seeds may manifest in subtle ways, affecting our relationships, our health, our emotional state, and even our life circumstances. Take, for example, a person who has always felt an inexplicable sense of connection to a particular place. Perhaps they feel deeply at home in a foreign country, or they are drawn to a specific cultural tradition, even though they have no personal history with it. This could be a karmic imprint from a past life where they lived in that place or practiced that tradition. While their conscious mind may not remember, the energy of their past actions continues to shape their present reality. Similarly, a person who struggles with unresolved fears or phobias might be experiencing the effects of past actions that left imprints in their consciousness. The fear of water in a child who has never drowned is an example of how past karmic actions can influence a person's present experiences, even when they are unaware of the cause. Understanding karma helps us to realize that the energy we create in this life shapes the conditions of our future. We may not be able to recall the specifics of our past actions, but we can still influence the future by cultivating positive, mindful intentions today. The Buddha taught that by acting with compassion, generosity, and wisdom, we can create karmic seeds that will grow into a future filled with peace and joy. On the other hand, actions driven by greed, hatred, and ignorance will sow the seeds of suffering, confusion, and despair. Karma, in essence, is the energy that flows through us, shaping the experiences we encounter. It is not bound by memory, nor is it contingent on our understanding of the past. The actions we take, driven by our intentions and motivations, shape our future. This is the power of karma. And in every moment, we have the ability to plant new seeds through our actions. This is the true freedom that the Buddha offers us, the freedom to shape our future through mindful and compassionate action in the present. The Buddha's teachings on karma remind us that we are not at the mercy of our past actions, but we are empowered by them. By understanding the subtle effects of our karmic energy, we can begin to cultivate new seeds in the present. Every thought, every word, every action is an opportunity to plant a seed that will shape our future. This is why the Buddha emphasized mindfulness, as it allows us to act with awareness and intention, creating karma that brings about true peace and liberation. So, instead of seeking to remember past lives or obsessing over the details of our past actions, we are invited to focus on the present moment. In this moment, we have the power to create new karma that will guide us toward liberation, compassion, and peace. The energy of our actions continues beyond memory, flowing through time and shaping the reality we experience. Let us then act with wisdom, compassion, and awareness, planting seeds for a future filled with love, peace, and freedom. Chapter 4: The Role of Forgetting, a Gift, Not a Flaw. You may find yourself wondering, why is forgetting not a flaw in the process of rebirth? This question touches on one of the most profound and often misunderstood aspects of the Buddha's teachings. The truth is, forgetting is not a mistake or an error in the cycle of life and death. Rather, it can be seen as a mercy, a gift woven into the very fabric of our existence. Imagine, for a moment, remembering every single detail of every life you have ever lived, not just the moments of triumph and joy, but also every heartbreak, betrayal, and loss. Imagine carrying the weight of not only your present life's wounds, but also the wounds of countless lifetimes. Could your heart bear such a burden? Could your mind, in all its fragility, carry the weight of so much suffering and still find the strength to move forward with compassion and clarity? It would be too much, it would be overwhelming. The burden of all that pain, all that sorrow would paralyze you, leaving you stuck in a loop of grief and regret. The Buddha, in his boundless wisdom, understood this. Most of us, as we live this life, struggle to forgive ourselves for the mistakes we've made, the pain we've caused, and the pain we've endured. And yet, we often fail to recognize how much lighter life becomes when we are able to let go of those burdens. Now imagine the weight of not just one life's mistakes, but hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives worth of suffering, struggles, and attachments. The weight would be unbearable, but forgetting is not erasure. It is not a wiping away of our past as if it never existed. Forgetting, as the Buddha taught, is a grace that allows us to start fresh. Each new life is an opportunity to shed the baggage of past identities and attachments, to begin anew with a clean slate. It is like waking up from a long, difficult dream and discovering that the pain, the burdens, the mistakes no longer weigh on you. You are free to live again, to experience the world with fresh eyes, unburdened by the weight of who you were. To truly appreciate the role of forgetting, let us look at a metaphor that might resonate deeply with us all. Think of the healing process that occurs when we break a bone. At first, the pain is excruciating. It lingers long after the fracture occurs, but over time, as the bone heals, the pain subsides, and we often forget the intensity of the experience. The healing process allows us to live without the constant reminder of that pain. It does not erase the experience, but allows us to move forward with a new sense of strength, unburdened by the past injury. In a similar way, forgetting in the cycle of rebirth acts as a form of spiritual healing. It helps us move forward, unburdened by the emotional and psychological weight of past actions, mistakes, and heartbreaks. Without the grace of forgetting, we would be trapped in a never-ending loop of pain and attachment, unable to step forward into the present moment with clarity and compassion. The Buddha understood this, and that is why he emphasized the importance of focusing on the present rather than dwelling on the past. One of the most liberating aspects of the Buddha's teachings is the recognition that true liberation comes not from remembering past lives or past actions, but from embracing who we are in the present moment. Our memories are past identities, and our attachments to them can only hold us back from living fully in the now. If we continually ask ourselves why we don't remember our past lives or why we can't recall the details of our past suffering, we remain trapped in a cycle of endless inquiry that keeps us from engaging with the present moment. The Buddha taught that the past, with all its suffering and joys, is like a distant shore. We can look back, we can reflect, but we cannot live there. We cannot dwell in the past and expect to grow. We cannot bring our past lives with us and expect to move forward with wisdom and peace. Instead, we must focus on the present moment, on the opportunities it offers for healing and transformation. By focusing on the present, we let go of the need to know who we were, and instead, we embrace the potential of who we can become. The Buddha often spoke of the need to heal the wounds of the present, rather than obsessing over where they came from or who caused them. It is as if we are standing in front of a fresh wound, one that has just been inflicted in this life, and we have the opportunity to heal it, to care for it, to let it go. But too often we focus not on healing, but on tracing the source of the wound. We wonder, who inflicted this pain upon me? Why did this happen? In doing so, we delay our healing by clinging to the past and refusing to move forward. The Buddha's path to healing, however, focuses on the present. Rather than holding onto the identity of the wounded person or the stories of our past, he invited us to focus on the action we can take in this moment. How can we respond to this life with compassion? How can we cultivate wisdom and care in the here and now? This is where true liberation lies, not in remembering or revisiting past lives, but in understanding who we are in this moment and responding with love, kindness, and mindfulness. When we stop asking ourselves, why don't I remember my past lives? We begin to free ourselves from the attachment to past identities. The true gift of forgetting is that it allows us to stop identifying with the roles we have played in previous lifetimes. It frees us from the stories we've told ourselves about who we were, the labels we've attached to our lives, and the expectations we've placed upon ourselves. By letting go of these attachments, we are free to experience life as it is, with all its beauty, impermanence, and possibility. Imagine for a moment a world where everyone is free from the weight of their past identities. A world where we can forgive ourselves, forgive others, and move forward with an open heart, unburdened by regret, guilt, or anger. This is the world the Buddha envisioned. A world where we recognize that forgetting is not a flaw but a mercy, a grace that allows us to live in the present and embrace the potential for healing, growth, and transformation. In the end, the Buddha's teachings remind us that life is a gift, a fleeting, ever-changing, and beautiful journey. Forgetting, in the context of rebirth, is not a flaw, it is a blessing that allows us to begin anew, free from the past. It is through letting go of the need to remember who we were, and instead embracing who we are in this moment, that we find true freedom. It is in this present moment that we can heal, grow, and cultivate the wisdom and compassion that will guide us to peace. Forget the past that weighs you down. Embrace the present moment as an opportunity for rebirth, for growth, and for the unfolding of your true potential. The past is gone, and in forgetting, we find the freedom to live fully in the now. Chapter 5: The Path Forward, Living with Awareness and Compassion. As we reflect on the teachings of the Buddha, one core message resonates deeply. True freedom arises when we release the attachment to remembering past lives and stop defining ourselves by past actions. We often cling to the illusion that there is a fixed self, a permanent I, that has a history, that has suffered or achieved, that carries the weight of our past mistakes and successes. This attachment to a static identity is what traps us in the cycle of suffering. But the Buddha's wisdom points us toward a radically different path, the path of letting go, of embracing impermanence, and of stepping into the present moment with a heart full of awareness and compassion. The illusion of a permanent self, or atta, is one of the primary causes of suffering. We define ourselves by our past, our experiences, our accomplishments, and even our failures. We use our memories to create a narrative of who we are, believing that this story gives us stability, purpose, and meaning. Yet the Buddha teaches us that this self is nothing more than a series of passing moments, thoughts, feelings, and sensations that come and go. When we identify with this fleeting, impermanent self, we inevitably cling to a past that no longer exists and worry about a future that is uncertain. We become trapped in the web of our own illusions. Take, for example, the story of a man who carries the memory of a past failure. He failed in business, lost everything, and became consumed by shame and regret. As time passes, he continues to define himself by that failure. Every new opportunity he encounters is filtered through the lens of that past experience, and as a result, he lives in fear of repeating his mistakes. This man is not living in the present, he is living in the shadow of his past. But what would happen if he could let go of that story? What if he stopped seeing himself as the man who failed and began seeing himself as the person he is right now, capable of growth, change, and new beginnings? The Buddha calls us to do just that, to let go of the false self we have constructed from our past actions and to step into the present moment without the weight of past identities. When we stop identifying with our past, we open the door to true transformation. We become free to respond to life as it is, without the fear of judgment or failure, without the burden of regret. Rebirth is often misunderstood. In many traditions, the idea of rebirth carries with it the notion of punishment or reward based on past actions. People believe that they must endure suffering in future lives as a consequence of their actions, or that they will be rewarded for their good deeds. But the Buddha's view of rebirth is much more profound and liberating. Rebirth is not about punishment or reward, it is about opportunity. It is the opportunity to continue the journey of self-realization, to refine our understanding of impermanence, and to cultivate wisdom and compassion. Each new life is not a continuation of suffering from past actions, but a fresh opportunity to live in alignment with the true nature of reality. Through each cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, we have the chance to evolve, to learn from our mistakes, and to transcend the limitations of our past. Rebirth is the opportunity to clear the mental fog created by attachment and desire, and to awaken to the present moment with clarity and compassion. Consider the example of a child who is born into a life of hardship. Perhaps the child faces poverty, illness, or loss. From the outside, it might seem like a continuation of past suffering. But what if that child, through this difficult life, develops deep compassion and wisdom? What if, through their suffering, they learn to be more kind, more generous, more loving? The Buddha would see this not as a punishment, but as an opportunity for growth, for awakening to the true nature of compassion, for breaking the cycle of suffering and ignorance. Rebirth is the opportunity to awaken, to live with awareness, and to rise above the limitations of the past. When we forget our past lives, we are not losing something valuable, we are gaining the freedom to live with fresh eyes. The Buddha's teachings emphasize that forgetting is not a flaw in the process of rebirth, but rather a gift. Without the burden of memory, we are free to respond to life's challenges without the baggage of old habits, past traumas, or attachments. Forgetting allows us to experience each moment as it is, uncolored by the distortions of past conditioning. Imagine being able to see the world as if for the first time, without the preconceived notions, biases, and fears that often cloud our vision. When we let go of the need to remember, we are no longer defined by the roles and identities of our past. We are free to experience the world directly, to engage with others with open hearts, and to move through life with a sense of wonder and curiosity. In that openness, we discover the potential for true awakening, for seeing things as they truly are, not as we have been taught to see them. One beautiful example of this is seen in the life of a skilled musician who plays effortlessly, not because they have remembered years of practice, but because the music flows naturally through them. They are not burdened by the idea of who they are as a musician or by the memories of past performances. Instead, they are simply present with the music, free to express what is alive in them at that moment. This is how we can live our lives, not as the sum of past experiences, but as beings who are fully present and open to the unfolding of each moment. The Buddha's path is clear. It is not about dwelling on the past or trying to remember who we were in previous lifetimes. It is about awakening to the present moment, living fully in the here and now with mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom. True liberation is not found by looking backward, but by looking forward, with clarity, with a heart free from attachment, and with an awareness that transcends the limits of our past. Rebirth, in this sense, becomes something to embrace, not fear. It is not a burden nor a punishment, but a natural and continuous unfolding of our consciousness. Each moment is an opportunity to live with greater awareness, to practice compassion, and to deepen our understanding of impermanence. When we stop clinging to the past, we are free to step into the present moment with open hearts and minds. As the Buddha so wisely taught, it is in this moment, this very breath, that true transformation can occur. It is through living with awareness and compassion in the present that we break free from the cycle of suffering, and it is in this present moment that we can find the ultimate peace, one that transcends the cycle of rebirth. So let us walk the path forward, not with the weight of our past lives or actions, but with the lightness of a heart that is free, a mind that is awake, and a spirit that is open to the infinite possibilities of the present moment. It is here in the now that we find our true liberation.